When I was a student at the senior college, this was, of course, the church I came to every Sunday. And at that time, Father Herbert Lindemann was the pastor here, a very remarkable pastor, a marvelous preacher. One little correction of the biography you heard: I did not teach liturgics at St. Louis. I simply spent that year working with faculty members who did teach liturgics to produce this. It was initially to be a guide toward celebrating the sacrament facing the people. In the 60s, that began to come in, and the men teaching worship at St. Louis felt that we should have some kind of guide for our seminarians and clergy. And so I was asked to come back and work on that, and I did that for a year, and it was an interesting project. But of course, the irony of it is that I was not then, nor am I now, persuaded with all due respect, Father David, I was not then, nor am I persuaded now, of the need for the Versus Populum celebration. That's another long topic, which I tried to say some things about at St. Michael's Conference a few years ago. But it is an irony, and even as I was preparing that, one of the faculty members, George Hoyer, said at one of our Friday afternoon meetings that, Charles keeps his distance from all this. And those Friday afternoon meetings were, we would meet for about an hour, and then Mrs. Hoyer would come out with a tray full of things to drink. I've been asked to talk this afternoon about solemn vespers. And of course, we all know what Vespers is. What the word solemn intends here is perhaps less familiar. This terminology comes to us, of course, from the tradition of the Catholic Church of the West. I suspect most of us are familiar with the three different kinds of celebration of the Mass that there were in the Roman Church before the Second Vatican Council. There was the so-called Low Mass, which was a spoken service with simply the priest and a server. Then there was the sung Mass, which was a Mass which was sung with a priest and perhaps two servers, but no deacon, no subdeacon, no incense. And then there was finally the Solemn Mass, which was with priest, deacon, subdeacon, incense, singing, all of that. Solemn Vespers comes also from the tradition of the Catholic Church of the West. And the word solemn simply indicates that it is a service conducted with the full ceremonial for that liturgy. So in the Roman Catholic Church, you have in the ceremonial manuals instructions for solemn vespers. This is a very eclectic bibliography. It's nothing scholarly. It's simply some books that may prove useful to you. But if you look at the bibliography, four down, there's Adrian Fortescue's The Ceremonies of the Roman Rite Described. Are any of you familiar with that at all? Yes, Father David Peterson is. The Ceremonies of the Roman Rite Described. And this is the most authoritative thing there is for the pre-Vatican II ceremonial of the Roman Catholic Church. Just above Fortescue, there's a book by Peter Elliott, who is an Australian, Ceremonies of the Modern Roman Rite, and it is an attempt to do for the modern Roman Rite what Adrian Fortescue did for the pre-Vatican II ceremonial. Now, I suppose one question that comes to mind with Lutherans, and a very valid question, is why should we be concerned about what the Roman Catholic ceremonial is for a service? And of course, part of the answer to that question is simply that the Lutheran rite is essentially the rite of the Catholic Church of the West, with only those things removed which contradict the truth of God's word written. How many of you have heard of a book called, it's by a German by the name of Graf. It's called The History of the Disintegration of the Ceremonies in the Lutheran Church. Father, yes, you're familiar with it. Geschichte der Auflesung der altgottesdienstlichen Formen. I can remember the German title better than the English. I have not read it. But the significance of the book is that it is a rather sad tale. Have you actually read in it? Okay, well, there are several volumes, 2 volumes. And it's a history of how the worship of the Lutheran Church is integrated over a period of years. And it's something perhaps it should be translated into English. So as we all know, through the depredations of the influence of Reformed Protestantism and through the rationalism of the 18th century, and then the unionism with the Reformed Church, the liturgy of the Lutheran Church was devastated. And it was only in the 19th century that there was the effort to recover the Lutheran liturgy. And this was done with some success with regard to the text of the services. The services we have now are an outcome of that 19th century revival, not only of confessionalism, but of the worship that goes along with it. One significant book in that connection that I understand is being translated now is Friedrich Lochner's work, Der Hauptgottesdienst der evangelisch-lutherischen Kirche. There's a facsimile edition that's been reprinted in recent years, but it's an absolutely wonderful work by Friedrich Lochner, who was a pastor in Milwaukee and in Springfield and taught liturgics at the Springfield Seminary. And it's a detailed study of the divine service, complete with a lot of the music that goes along with it. And it's an excellent thing, and I look forward to, I have read that. I look forward to that appearing. So to get back to the question of why we would look to these Romish sources for our ceremonial, again, the basic answer is that our liturgy is essentially that of the Catholic Church of the West. But within the broadly called liturgical movement in Lutheranism, there have been, in a sense, 2 schools of thought about the norm for our ceremonial usages. Not that there's ever been any formal decision like that. But in the course of the liturgical revival, which in the Missouri Synod begins with well, in a sense, the 19th century thing was a liturgical revival, but the ceremonial revival really begins with the founding of the Liturgical Society of St. James at St. John's Church in Hoboken, New Jersey, around 1925, when the Reverend Berthold von Schenk, Mrs. Filer here, grew up in Dr. von Schenk's parish. But it was there that they founded that society, and they started publishing Pro Ecclesia Lutherana. And it had an influence, especially in the New York area. There were a number of churches which were deeply influenced by that. But there was sort of this division of opinion. Some felt that the thing to do about the ceremonial was simply to look at the available Roman Catholic ceremonial manuals and to follow those instructions insofar as they did not contradict Lutheran doctrine. As long as the ceremonial was did not suggest some Romish errors, that would be followed. But then there were others who said that what we really should be doing is to consider what the ceremonial of Germany and Scandinavia was in the 16th century at the time of the Reformation. And it was especially Father Arthur Karl Piepkorn who was one of the advocates for that. I want to read to you an excerpt about that topic. It's from a wonderful little pamphlet. Mine is so messed up after I've had it for over 50 years. It's a book called What the Symbolical Books of the Lutheran Church Have to Say About Worship and the Sacraments. It was published in 1952 by Concordia Publishing House, and it's just a very helpful summary of what the symbols say, and it's quoted at length with the references. But anyway, this question of ceremonial, and the reason I'm talking about this is because when we want to talk about how do you do solemn vespers, this is one of the questions we have to ask. So in the section about worship, Dr. Piepkorn has this to say: in its concrete form, the Lutheran rites of the Reformation century, like the Lutheran doctrinal formulations of the Reformation century, reflect the fact that the Church of the Augsburg Confession is consciously and determinedly a part of the Catholic Church of the West. I heard some accents of that in Bishop Litkin's remarks earlier this afternoon. Piepkorn goes on to say, the basic ceremonial and ritual principle of the Reformation is liturgical conservatism. A maximum of traditional rite and ceremony is to be retained. The criterion in each case is, can this specific item be retained without compromising evangelical truth? If so, it is to be kept. And then he cites several passages from the symbols to that effect, and goes on to say, in essence, the reformers are saying, absolutely considered, we could be very radical without sinning against an express precept of God. Actually, we recognize an obligation born of our historic past and our historic situation not to exercise the liberty that we could theoretically invoke. As little as they felt that they could dispense with the doctrinal categories, formulations, and terminology which they had inherited, so little did they feel themselves privileged to dispense with their inherited worship categories and formulations. Both comprised symbols. Absolutely, these symbols were only the vehicles, the shells, the husks, the mass, the larvae of the divine truth. Their theology used verbal symbols, their worship used ceremonial symbols. But in both areas, the symbol and the thing symbolized, when considered concretely, actually, and historically, coalesced, and could not, without great peril, be separated. The reformers are familiar with the Greek rite and with the liturgical pronouncements of the fathers of the undivided church, and they cite both in support of their doctrinal position where appropriate. The basis of their liturgical rites and ceremonies, however, is the medieval Western rite as the church in Northern Europe observed it at the beginning of the 16th century. Unlike the Anglican reformers, the Lutheran reformers are not concerned about conforming their rite either to the Eastern or to the primitive church. Now, of course, what happened in the 1960s with the Second Vatican Council and all of the liturgical results of that council, I was going to use a less pleasant word, but there was a concern with being primitive. You know, we wanted to get back to more primitive uses, but that was not the concern of the Lutheran reformers. Then Piepkorn goes on to say, The 16th century saw the beginning of extensive innovations in Roman ritual and ceremonial. In general, these had not reached Northern Europe by the time the Reformation began. Consequently, they exerted only slight influence on the historic Lutheran rite. Where the historic Lutheran rite has been retained or restored, it generally reveals a purer and older form of the Western rite than the Reformed Roman Catholic rite of today, and he's talking before the council, exhibits. This is significant. It gives us a denominationally and confessionally distinctive rite to which we have historic title and which we have not lately borrowed from alien sources. It gives us a rite which is an invaluable symbol of the antiquity, the historic continuity, and the thorough Catholicity of the Church of the Augsburg Confession. At the same time, it gives us a rite which is both older than and significantly and recognizably different from the present Roman Catholic rite. So what Piepkorn is essentially saying is that in terms of our liturgical, rather ceremonial practice, we should consider what the usages were in the 16th century. Now, one of the problems with that is that, to the best of my knowledge, apart from Saling's multi-volume work, the Kirchenordnung and the church orders of the 16th century, I don't know how much we know. We have some wonderful pictures which show the vestment usage and altar appointments. There are some things in correspondence which describe, for example, how the Mass was celebrated in Wittenberg. There's one which describes how it was done at the end of the meeting that produced the Wittenberg Concord. But I think one interesting task for some energetic young scholar would be to do as thorough a study as can be made, for example, of Saling's Kirchenordnungen, and see what in there would indicate what the ceremonial usages were. Another possibility is to look at the actual Latin service books that were in use both in Germany and in Scandinavia in the 16th century, because it's clear that they would more or less have continued a lot of what they were familiar with. So this is a task that I believe would be worthwhile and would give us some, I suppose, authority, heft in what the usages might be. So, where does that leave us then with regard to solemn vespers? I think I doubt that anyone is going to want to follow all of the prescriptions in Fortescue. I see Father David smiling. It's quite something. But essentially, what makes solemn vespers solemn in the rites that I know of is the censing of the altar at the Magnificat. This is the ceremonial highlight of Vespers, the censing of the altar, and then of the clergy and people at the Magnificat. The Magnificat, of course, being the climax of Vespers, because it's the great canticle of the Incarnation. That is why it is marked with the use of incense. It was never customary to have a deacon and subdeacon at solemn vespers. There could be assistant clergy. Certainly there were lectors, and the assistant clergy would not wear dalmatic and tunicle as you would for solemn Mass, but the assistant clergy wore copes. This was pretty much the medieval usage. And it is the usage in the Roman rites. So the assisting clergy, if they're to wear more than a plain surplice, would wear a cope. For Vespers, there is no need to wear a stole. Vespers is not a sacramental event. And so really the officiant need only wear the surplice and then the cope. Let's see here. So I would like to say something then about, and show you something about the censing of the altar. You may notice that I did not list in the bibliography that book, The Conduct of the Services. And the reason is that in rereading the section on Matins and Vespers in preparation for this conference, I was rather appalled at the tone of my remarks. It's always an interesting experience at the age of 73 to look back at something you wrote at the age of 27. And the 27-year-old Charles MacLean was, he was very definite. And I would say much too definite and even peremptory. And if you read through that section on Matins and Vespers, it really is too much. And to tell you the truth, I mean, I don't want to do any damage to the business of selling these books. Yes. But really, in terms of a manual for liturgical practice, I think Paul Lang's Ceremonial and Celebration is a much more accessible book than The Conduct of the Services. And some of you may have heard me say before that the first, after I did this, 1969-70, the thing was published through the Concordia Seminary print shop, and there was some kind of weird modern art on the cover. It was an ugly book, really. And the reaction of the seminarians to the book was that they thought that what that art was on the cover was a jangled nerve. So that was their reaction to it. So I would take that Matins and Vespers thing with a grain of salt. As far as the rest of the book is concerned, certainly Father Peepcorn's The Conduct of the Service, which appears in there, is a standard work that is always useful to refer to. I commend that very highly. So where were we? We were talking about the censing of the altar. That takes place at the Magnificat. This thing I handed out, this is just a photocopy from a missal, Mass book. And it gives the pattern for censing an altar that is against the wall. Is the censer here ready, Father Michael? I just want to show this, and then you might want to ask questions. By all means, another thing, that Conduct of the Services book, for heaven's sakes, don't try to follow the diagram in there for censing a freestanding altar. It comes from one of the transitional missals of the 1960s, from the old Roman Rite to the new, and it is much too complicated. And in terms of using incense, one practical thing is have the coals nice and hot. Because if they're not nice and hot, there's going to be no smoke. And that looks very silly. And you know there's a distinction between our Roman and our Anglo-Catholic brethren. In the Roman Church for years, and I think it's still pretty much true, they use so little incense that someone said it takes an act of faith to believe that it's happening. On the other hand, if any of you have been to any of the great Anglo-Catholic shrine churches, you know that there are clouds and clouds and clouds of incense. Too much of a good thing, perhaps. But, okay, and then you make the sign of the cross, and the words you say are, be blessed in honor of him, be blessed by him in whose honor you are to be burned. Some of you, of course, remember the words that the celebrant says to the deacon when he goes to read the gospel. May the Lord be in your heart and on your lips, that you may worthily and properly proclaim the holy gospel. Well, there was a high mass some years ago, and the celebrant got muddled. And he said to the deacon as he asked the blessing, be blessed by him in whose honor you are to be burned. And what made it even funnier is that the priest in question then preached a very controversial sermon. But anyway, with a freestanding altar, you first of all, if you're on this side, 3 double swings to the crucifix. The double swing is just, it's almost a natural thing. The thing sort of goes back and forth like that. But for example, here, just as Father Michael did this morning, 3 double swings to the crucifix. And then you simply walk around the altar, sensing as you go. It's very, very simple. One thing to be avoided, and this sometimes happens, is people will sidestep as they sense the altar. And this is, it doesn't work very well. It looks odd. Now, the altar against the east wall, if you look at you can watch what I do. It's 3 double swings to the crucifix. And you take your time, and then it goes here, 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 and circles this way, and then like this. It may seem complicated. Once you have done it a few times, it becomes sort of second nature. And bow each time, of course, you pass the cross. And then you hand it off to the thurifer, and if you do the sensings of the people involved, the thurifer then does 3 doubles to the officiant or celebrant. And then if there's a group of acolytes, you sense them once in the middle, once to the left, once to the side, that side, that side. And then the thurifer can come down and sense the congregation once in the middle, once to the left, once to the right. Questions? Any questions? No questions, okay. But I hope that gives you some, yes.
Do you bring the incense all the way down the aisle as well?
No, the thurifer just stands really at the edge of the chancel, right here. And whenever a group of people is sensed, you sense in the middle, to the left, to the right. Now, there's nothing theologically necessary about any of that. It's just conventional, it's a convention, it's a custom. And and there's sort of a hierarchy of sensing the officiants. For example, if you have a solemn Eucharist, after the celebrant has sensed the altar, he hands the thurible to the deacon, and the deacon does 3 double swings to the celebrant, and then he hands the censer to the subdeacon, who then senses the deacon. And then the subdeacon hands the thurible to the thurifer, who senses the acolytes in the congregation. If you look at that book, The Ceremonies of the Roman Rite Described, it's listed in there. I love the smell of incense. I really do. Yes, Father David.
We haven't used incense much. I'm really a novice. My sense is always been with these patterns, at the altar, for example.
Yeah.
Is that the idea is to just try to get smoke on everything.
Yes.
So the idea is to just try to cover the full front, cover the top, cover the sides.
Yes, it has several levels of meaning. I mean, the altar itself is a symbol of Christ in his church. And so the incense offered to the altar is in honor of Christ. The altar is also the place where the prayers of God's people are offered to him. And the incensing of the altar suggests the incense of our prayers going up to God. And the reason for the censings of the various participants in the liturgy is to show that all of us are included in these prayers. There's also the fact it's an honorific in a way, because although we are fallen in sin and the image of God is only slowly being restored in us, still as human beings we have been made in the image and likeness of God. And so when the thurible is swung towards someone, it is a way of honoring the image of God, which we as human beings bear. And I mean that pattern, for example, in this drawing, this pattern for censing the altar, it's just a form that became widespread, I guess, following the Reformation. To what extent it was used at the Reformation time, we don't know.
I mean, there's some symbolism in the number of swings sometimes.
Yeah.
Like at the Eucharist or the elements.
Oh, yes, and that's, yeah.
There's got to be, what's the point of the pattern? What does it matter how it's done?
It doesn't, well, 3 is a holy number in Christianity. I mean, it's hard to say, well, why then are 3 crosses made over the bread and wine after the offertory? And then let's see, it's twice counterclockwise and once clockwise over the bread and wine.
I guess what I was wondering was, you wanted to simplify it. If you wanted to bring incense in, you wanted to maybe simplify it a little bit. What would be the principles that you would use? Like, I'm thinking, I don't want to bring up all these circles.
Yeah. Well, I think I would strive for simplicity. I would strive for simplicity, and if you don't, for example, now, the censing of the bread and wine at the offertory, we do know, in fact, that was still being done in the Magdeburg Cathedral in the early 17th century. That we do know, the Lutheran Cathedral in Magdeburg. After the bread and wine were put on the altar, the celebrant did cense the bread and wine. Now, whether he did it that way or not, we don't know. But I mean, you could make one sign of the cross in one circle. It would not be a sin. But I think in introducing incense into the usage of the church, I think I would strive for simplicity at the beginning.
What would you say is the chief ceremony in the usage? After censing of the altar, what's the main ceremony you do?
Incensing the altar?
Yeah.
Well, I would just say it's censing the altar. With a freestanding altar like this, it's very simple to do. You simply walk around it.
Walking around it for a freestanding altar would be that'd be the essence of it?
Yeah, and that's what's done throughout Western Christendom today. Where there's a freestanding altar, you simply walk around it, swinging the censer.
And if it's an altar up against the wall, walking back and forth?
Yeah, well, I think I don't know precisely what to suggest. Actually, the pattern here, once you know it, you have to, and another thing is to avoid being ostentatious about it, I mean, small swings, don't, be...
Be ostentatious? Can you avoid being ostentatious? Swinging a thurible or burning bowls, filling smoke?
Well, yes, I see the Mr. Demarest in the back has a question.
I do. It's something of a historical question.
Yes.
You mentioned we don't really know the full use of Roman churches.
Yes. To the best of my knowledge. Now, perhaps there is some source that, yeah.
So just granting that somewhat, is it largely because, I mean, sort of a softball deal, I mean, pietism and rationalism very much, cut into and destroy part of our ceremony.
Oh, yes.
Inherited, we kind of have this gap, and so there's this understandable suspicion of people who want to bring things back.
Oh, sure, sure.
It's really a genuine article. How do we know? So when we have an attempt to bring back ceremonials in churches, certainly in the first generation of any Reformation, any Renaissance, there's the question of like, well, this is a putting on of air. This is
Sure.
pretense. This is ostentation. How do we know that this is even Lutheran?
Sure.
And, I mean, how much
Well,
resistance to this or rich ceremonial in general?
well, two things we know for sure about incense are that in Luther's Formula Missae of 1523, when he's going through the order, what to do, after the gradual and sequence hymn, he says, "Here follows the gospel where we prohibit neither candles nor censing." So there is a reference to censing in the Formula Missae. There is the Magdeburg Cathedral. There's also, if that book, is it called Faith and Action? Faith and Act. In there are some descriptions of the various ecclesiastical objects that Lutheran churches had. And one of the objects that turns up in the records is a censer. So if they had a censer, it certainly indicates that, incense was probably used. But I think what you said initially about the influence of the Reformed, Calvinism, Pietism, the Enlightenment, Unionism, all of that destroyed the continuity of worship traditions. And what happened was that the living memory was lost. And I suspect this is part of what Graf's book, The History of the Dissolution of the Worship Practices, would document. Could you say something about that, Father?
Yeah, Graf's book goes through and describes the liturgy as it was practiced in various places and shows how changes were made to it here and there to simplify or make it more didactic, and ended up gutting it as time went on. I'm pretty sure he says something about incense, but I cannot remember what it was.
Yes, I assume the Fort Wayne Seminary has that book in its collection, and if so, I'm going to try to borrow it and do some reading in it. Yes?
You had referenced that one of the primary symbolic functions of incensing the altar was as an honorific.
Yes.
Would you also say that there's an element of symbolism of purification?
Yes, yes.
That is taking one step further, the sanctification of sacred space.
Yes.
That we are doing symbolic action to say that this space,
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
these participants and we, the congregation, are being symbolically sanctified for the action that we are about to partake in.
Yes, absolutely. I hope you all heard that. And I mean, I think ceremonials have levels and levels and levels of meaning. Yes.
I wanted to mention, you've talked about getting to know the liturgy at the eve of the Reformation. There's a Facebook group, and Matthew Carver is very much involved with it, and it's called Germany's Liturgies and Uses, AD 800 to 1530.
Oh, that's
And
marvelous.
up there, I've posted it was a couple months ago, but I posted links to scanned editions of missals and liturgies from various different cities in Germany from around 1500 through to about 1517.
And that is up on the internet.
Yeah, so that's up at Facebook. It's called Germany's Liturgies and Uses AD 800
Well,
1530.
well, there you are. That would be very useful to get some sense of what. Yes, George?
Is there ever any adornment of this with music or some other auditory?
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, the sensing of the altar at the introit. The introit is sung. We saw that this morning. And then at the offertory, there usually is music going on. Oh, yes, definitely, definitely. Yes, Father David?
When would a congregation pray solemn vespers, and why should they?
Okay, solemn vespers, I mean, basically what it is, it's a festal form of vespers. That's what it is. Solemn vespers is festal vespers. And certainly every festival of the church year, and really every Sunday. In some of the liturgical society of St. James parishes, such as St. Faith's Church in Cleveland, where F.R. Weber was pastor, and St. John's in Hoboken, they had solemn vespers on Sundays. I mean, that was in the days when people came to church on Sunday evening. Now we're lucky if we get them on Sunday morning. But I would make one suggestion. The use of incense at the gospel is very ancient. We know that, and Luther mentions it. And so the incense then, it's a way of honoring the word of God, because after the deacon or whoever reads the gospel announces it, he senses the book, middle, left, right. And that is honoring God's word written. And the other thing is that at the words, therefore with angels and archangels and with all the company of heaven, the thurifer can come into the chancel and kneel down. And then at each of the elevations, 3 double swings toward the host and the cup, a way of acknowledging the real presence. When I was a student at Bronxville, I attended St. John's Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in Brooklyn. And Richard Klupp was pastor there then. And every Sunday, we would use incense at the gospel and at the consecration. And then on great feast days, we'd use it at the introit and the offertory. And yes.
With respect to the auditory question that George had asked, a few years ago at a Higher Things gathering,
Yes.
the pastor who was censing the altar and the people, there was a lot of clanging. And he was asked about that, and he said it was intentional. He didn't know what the reason for it was, other than that when he had observed it, they intentionally had the chain or the ring at the end clanging against it, and he thought it was perhaps an auditory thing to go with the visual and the olfactory. Is there any substance to making it intentionally clang?
I think it's just something that happens. However you handle it, it can. Now, of course, those of you who are familiar with Eastern Orthodox usage know that their censers often have bells on them. And so when in the Orthodox Church, the deacon or the priest goes around censing, the bells are ringing too. And I think there are some Lutherans who do that too. I mean, all of these ceremonial things are, you really can't say something is right and wrong.
I was just wondering whether there was any
I don't
reasoning that was available.
No, I've never heard any reason for the clanking of the chains of the censer. One Anglican practice that is very dangerous, and if you've ever been to a solemn procession in an Anglican church, sometimes the thurifer will do a complete circle with the thurible. That is extremely dangerous and silly. That's ostentatious and silly. I don't know. But it is curious. I mean, I suppose incense is the most difficult ceremonial thing to reintroduce in our churches, and yet when you look at it, it's really one of the most biblical ceremonials we have. And of course, the story goes that some lady was complaining to her pastor about the introduction of incense in the church, and the pastor said to her, "Well, my dear, in the life to come, you have a choice of two smells, incense or fire and brimstone." So, well, I think I have come almost to the end of my comments. Any other questions? Yes.
Was the efficient kind of historically intone the Magnificat getting started, or is that always required?
It's the efficient can. It's probably easier if a cantor does it.
If you were in a situation where only the officiant was available to do that, would he do that and then go to the censor and continue?
I'm not sure there's a. Off the top of my head, if you're going to be censing, put the incense on and then intone the Magnificat. I think that probably would be the easiest, but I don't think there is an answer, because
Say that again. You what?
if you have no cantor to intone the Magnificat, and so the officiant has to intone it, the question was, when do you intone it? Before you put on incense or afterwards? And I suppose whatever would seem easiest. There's a certain amount of just common sense with some of
He
this.
had some trouble getting the altar at the Mass, getting it censed before the Gloria Patri.
Oh,
So at the intro, would you stop for the Gloria Patri and then finish? What if it goes into the Kyrie, the air?
the tradition has been that the celebrant doesn't stop censing during the Gloria Patri. That has been traditional. And I think as a practical thing, just to get it done, probably, the only time, I mean, for example, if at Vespers you cense the altar and then also want to have the censing of the clergy, the acolytes, the congregation, if the Gloria Patri comes up, then the thurifer does stop and face the altar until the Gloria Patri has been sung. The thurifer stops, but the officiant just continues to cense. It's interesting.